Hi, and welcome to part 2 of this week 4 presentation, where I will begin by picking up right where I left off in part 1, which was introducing you to Windows Azure. Windows Azure Online Backup is a backup service that is offered by Microsoft. Essentially, Azure is a way for organizations to store their backups in the cloud. The process involves an automated backup procedure, and for security, the backups are encrypted before the information is transmitted. While this is a paid-for service, for those companies that do not have an advanced infrastructure enabling them to adequately perform and store their backups, Azure can be a good option. Okay, so I've talked a good bit about configuring and managing backups within Server 2012. So now let's take a brief look at server recovery. First of all, an organization's disaster recovery plan must not only contain a server backup plan, but it must also contain a server recovery plan. This plan should be a comprehensive breakdown of all of the requirements for bringing the affected servers back online. It should come as no surprise that the Windows Server Backup feature is an administrator's main tool for restoring backed up servers or server components. Just the same as we can use Windows Server Backup in order to back up the entire server, the system state, selected volumes, or specific files and folders, we can also use it to restore these items as well. When restoring files and folders, shadow copies can be used also. Throughout your reading and the labs for this week, you will learn about the different methods that are used for restoring servers, so I will not get into those details here. However, there are some special considerations when restoring an Active Directory controller that really do need to be addressed. First of all, there are two types of restores, non-authoritative restore and authoritative restore. If you perform a non-authoritative restore on a domain controller, the domain controller will be returned to whatever state it was in when the backup was performed. Then, during normal replication, the other domain controllers will replicate any necessary changes to the restored domain controller. Alternatively, an authoritative restore will result in the restored domain controller replicating to the other domain controllers, thereby overriding their data. As you can imagine, you must be very careful in selecting the correct type of restore, and you must be extremely careful when performing an authoritative restore. If you make a mistake when you're performing an authoritative restore, once replication occurs, fixing your mistake could be quite a hassle. Administrators most often use authoritative restores in order to undo changes that have already been replicated to other domain controllers on the network. This is one of the more efficient ways to restore objects that have been accidentally deleted. Okay, next, let's take a look at some of the key terms for this week. Here you see several of them on this slide. The first here is bare metal recovery. This is a Windows Server Backup configuration option that allows a recovery from a hard drive failure to another machine. The next term, Hyper-V snapshots. Snapshots provide a way to capture and store a virtual machine's current state and can be used to restore a virtual machine to a prior condition. Our next term here, shadow copies for shared volumes. This uses the volume shadow copy service, or VSS, to capture and restore copies of network shared files. The next term you see here on this slide, system state. This is a Windows Server backup configuration option that backs up all of the files needed to restore Active Directory. Next term you see is Windows Azure Online Backup. This is a Server 2012 feature that allows an administrator to back up files to the cloud-based storage option that is offered by Microsoft. Windows Server Backup. This is a Windows Server feature that can be used to back up and restore a server. The last term you see here on this slide, Active Directory Recycle Bin. If enabled, the Active Directory Recycle Bin provides a simpler alternative to an authoritative restore when restoring a deleted Active Directory object. On this slide we have a few additional key terms. The first one here, authoritative restore. Talked a little bit about this, but when restoring the system state of a domain controller, an authoritative restore marks Active Directory objects as being authoritative so that the current state of the object is replicated to other domain controllers. The next term, Boot Configuration Data Editor, or BCD. The BCD editor rather. This is a command line tool that allows you to edit the boot configuration data. Remember, this is having to do with a machine that has multiple operating systems installed that you have the ability to boot to. The next term you see here, msconfig. It's a configuration tool that allows Windows administrators to troubleshoot system startup problems. The next term, System File Checker. That's a command line tool that can be used to check the integrity of a hard disk. Windows Boot Manager. This is part of the boot configuration data store that allows you to choose a bootloader. Again, this is if you have multiple operating systems installed. And the last term you see here on this slide, the Windows Recovery Environment. This is a pre-boot environment that provides a set of utilities that can be used to recover a system that will not boot due to a corrupt operating system file, services, or corrupt drivers. Okay, so a couple of the key terms here that we've talked about are valuable tools for troubleshooting Windows systems, and I would like to take just a few minutes here to introduce you to them. The two tools that I would like to highlight here are msconfig and the Windows Recovery Environment. Okay, so first let's take a look at the msconfig tool. You can start up the msconfig tool by clicking on the Start button and then typing msconfig in the search bar. Looking at this slide, first of all notice that the tool has 5 different tabs. The first tab allows you to either select a normal startup, a diagnostic startup, or a selective startup. A normal startup is just that, and that is the option that is selected by default. The diagnostic startup would be useful if your computer or server were experiencing some problems during startup. With this option, only basic drivers and services are loaded up at startup. Selective startup gives the user the ability to choose whether to load certain system services or startup items. The next tab is the Boot tab. And this tab gives you the ability to change certain boot values, set debug parameters, or automatically boot into safe mode without having to use one of the function keys while the system is booting up. Okay, the next tab is the Services tab, which is one of the most useful in the MS Config tool. Matter of fact, let me go ahead and bring that up real quick. Bring this up so that you can look at more than just the tabs themselves. Okay, so we just talked about the boot tab, and here's everything that's available there. Okay, so now here's the services tab that I'm talking about. This tab is the most useful when you want to see what third-party services are running on your computer or server. The Services tab makes it easy to differentiate between third-party services and Microsoft services. And you can kind of see that here as you look in the manufacturer column. Of course, if there's a service that is causing a problem during startup, it is almost always related to third-party software. The next tab that you see is the Startup tab. Here you can select what services to run at startup. If your system has become slow during startup, it is often due to third-party services as a result of software that is installed on the system. Using the Startup tab, we can stop some services from running at startup, thereby potentially speeding up the startup process. Okay, and finally we have the Tools tab, and it provides access to many commonly used Windows operating system tools. However, all of the tools that are available here can be accessed in other more straightforward ways. So most administrators do not access these tools through the MS Config tool. Okay, the other tool that I would like to highlight here in this presentation is the Windows Recovery Environment. Okay, but we will pick that up in part 3 of this presentation. So at this point, I'm going to conclude part 2 of this week 4 presentation. Originally, I had planned on having only 2 parts to this presentation, but due to time constraints, I will have to conclude this presentation with a 3rd part. So this concludes part 2 of this week 4 presentation.